Thank you, Thomas, and thank you to Rob and for George for having me along again. I want to have a different take on the question of the social utility of finance. In particular, I want to focus on the possibility of equilibria in financial markets that are true Nash equilibria, but that are nonetheless socially inefficient in some sense. In particular, where that inefficiency derives from an arms race. And we know that, the classic arms race does deliver socially inefficient equilibria. The desire for individual safety results in an equilibrium where everyone is collectively less safe. I think I want to talk about some examples where similar sorts of dynamics are at play in the financial sector, where competition can be, in fact, a public bad. So it's not just in finance. So this is a picture of an elephant seal. And elephant seals are very fat. This one weighs around 6,000 pounds, about the same as your average American family. Sorry, average American family car, sorry. And it's big for a reason. It's a Darwinian reason, which is that male elephant seals fight each other on the beaches for the right to mate with all of the females, all of them. Winner genuinely takes all in the elephant seal world, and that's why they are so big. The size gene has been dominant. They have coordinated on a high blubber equilibrium. But this comes at a cost for the elephant seal. It makes them easy prey on land. It's very difficult to slip effortlessly into the sea if you weigh the same as a family saloon car. And during the 18th and 19th century, this meant that there was a time when elephant seals were felt to be extinct, having been hunted by man. It was only when government intervened, that their numbers recover. An example of an arms race in nature, which, while understandable, while individually rational, results for the elephant seal, and indeed many other animals, in a socially deeply suboptimal outcome. This is mirrored throughout social as well as natural systems, as we know. I'm sure during the course of the conference, mention's been made of Garrett Hardin's classic paper on the tragedy of the commons. The metaphor that Hardin used to make sense of that tragedy was one in which individual herdsmen, in their desire to graze one more cow, resulted ultimately in the ruination of those commons. We have examples from throughout economic theory of relative behaviors, of relative standings, counting, be it for setting of wages or of prices or consumption or employment. Keeping up with the Joneses type behaviors, arms races, do appear to proliferate across most aspects of human behavior. Finance is plainly no exception. In fact, in some respects, the very structure of finance means that these arms race type behaviors, this keeping up with the Joneses, is even more prevalent than in other aspects of human behavior. Let me mention one structural feature that delivers that, which is information asymmetry. I mean, finance is founded on information asymmetry, on people not knowing. And one response to people not knowing, of acting in a world of deep uncertainty about how much risk is truly being borne, who are the good guys in finance and who are the bad guys in finance. One response to that uncertainty, to that information asymmetry, is to rank, is to order firms, is to convey financial information as league tables. And if you convey information as league tables in finance, you generate just the types of arms race dynamics that we saw from the elephant seal, that we saw from the cattle herdsman. And that we know in turn generates, possibly will generate these socially deeply suboptimal outcomes, what I've called red queen races, races where however fast you travel, no one ever wins. For the elephant seal, in fact, everyone loses. So that's a bit of context. Let me give you some examples, concrete examples of these arms race dynamics appearing in the financial sphere. I'm going to talk about three very briefly. One from the past, one from the present, and one from the potential future. The one from the past is the race in returns in the banking system that we saw pre-crisis. The one from the present is the speed race that is currently being carried out in financial markets. And the one for the future is the quest for safety that we're seeing also across the financial system. So let's start with the first. The race in returns that was a key driver, generator, propagator of the crisis. With hindsight, returns to both financial capital and to financial labor were extraordinary by any historical metric in the run-up to the crisis. The left-hand side picture looks at the return on equity on UK banks, looking back over a roughly 100-year cycle. Returns on equity to UK and other banks pre-crisis were at historically unprecedented levels. The 1920s is the closest we might remotely come. The right-hand side panel just blows up returns on equity among all global banks during the run-up to crisis from 1990 onwards. It is a steady ascent, and one interpretation of that steady ascent, what behaviors were driving that it was an arms race. It was not so much a case of keeping up with the Joneses, but instead of keeping up with the Goldmans. If Goldman posted a return on equity of 20%, everyone else felt they needed to leapfrog ahead and do at least as well. And the simple way in which that leapfrogging was achieved was by taking on leverage. The only way through which that return on equity leapfrog could be achieved was by taking on leverage. The result of this arms race in returns on equity was that everyone converged to a high return on equity and therefore high leverage and therefore high risk equilibrium, which sowed the seeds of the crisis we've been living through for the last 3 or 4 years. That is why returns on equity returned to earth, indeed below earth, in 2007, 2008. That pattern in returns to financial capital was mirrored in returns, has been mirrored in returns to financial labor. Again, the left-hand side picture is taken from Philippon and Reshef's important work on returns in finance versus returns in non-finance. For investment and universal banking, this was a period that isn't even close to any historical precedent, not even the 1920s. The left-hand side, the right-hand side picture just looks at CEO, bank CEO compensation among that same set of global banks. It too ascends pretty much in line with the ascent in returns on equity. Some of that is easy to explain because increasingly through this period, CEOs, senior executives in the banks were in fact being remunerated on the basis of equity-based metrics, or in some cases remunerated in equity. So we had the same arms race dynamics, the same keeping up with the Goldmans in CEO pay as we had in ROE to banking. The only difference between the CEO pay and ROE in banking charts is that while the ROEs fell off a cliff, that's much less obviously been the case with CEO pay in banking so far. You can all draw your own conclusions from that. That was the return race. Let me talk about the speed race, because that's one that's been playing out and is still playing out over the last 10 years or so. You back up 20 years, and trade execution times in financial markets were measured in minutes. You back up 10 years, and those trade execution times were measured in seconds. You back up 5 years, and those trade execution times were measured in milliseconds. You look at today, and trading execution is measured in microseconds, in millionths of a second. Tomorrow, it will be nanoseconds, billionths of a second. The day after tomorrow, it could well be picoseconds, trillionths of a second. It has given rise, we've seen the rise over the last 10 years of this phenomenon that is high frequency trading. Those traders now dominate many of our mainstream financial markets, accounting for anywhere between a half and 3/4 of volumes transacted, for example, in the world's major equity markets. One reason they dominate volumes is because they submit huge volumes of quotes in the market, most of which, the vast majority of which, are never exercised. The firms cancel them before they're ever exercised. And the right-hand side picture just looks at the ratio of orders cancelled to orders executed in the US equity market over the last 10 years or so. So at present, for every order executed, 60 are cancelled. So what's going on here? Well, I mean, one thing that's going on is that although there are loads of quotes on the screen, if you try and hit them, they've disappeared before you can ever transact as you would wish. There is a mirage of liquidity. A second feature is that some have said that this practice of putting in multiple quotes, of quote stuffing in the language, is effectively an externality. Why? Because bandwidth is a common good. Bandwidth is finite. So by quote stuffing, you are using up bandwidth and slowing down everyone else. You are imposing an externality on slow traders, which might matter a lot if prices are moving around a lot. This high-frequency trading behavior has both a mirage of liquidity effect and an externality in terms of bandwidth being used. And both of those externalities were well exemplified on the 6th of May 2010, the well-known flash crash. At that point, the mirage of liquidity was shown to be just that. The mirage disappeared before our eyes, liquidity evaporated at speed, and what's more, bandwidth message traffic went through the roof, which meant that everyone else, those slower in the queue, those who couldn't keep up in the race, were unable to transact, and therefore there was a divergence between the prices of similar securities on different exchanges. The red line on the left-hand side picture speaks to that. The flash crash was no one-off. In the period since, although less publicized, there have been hundreds of mini flash crashes. The sources of those was this race, this speed race in financial markets that brings with it the externality of fragile liquidity, that brings with it the externality of order cancellation. The final race I want to talk about is the flip of the first one I mentioned. Because what we've seen over the last year or two is not so much a quest for risk, but instead a quest for safety. And that's been felt particularly acutely by the banking system, which has found that investors in their paper increasingly want the safety, the security of collateral. In other words, investors in banks are much less willing to invest in them on unsecured terms than in the past. Everyone wants to be senior. Everyone wants to be first in the queue. Everyone wants first claim on the assets of the bank. We're engaged in a race to safety. It's a race that no one can win. Not everyone can be first in the pecking order. Not everyone can be senior. And of course, central banks, in the liquidity against collateral they have provided, have been part and parcel of this race to safety. As an example, take the left-hand side picture. That looks at the refinancing requirements of euro area banks this year. They total about $1.1 trillion. And most of that needs refinancing is the blue bar, which is unsecured. It's money taken out on unsecured terms in the past. If we look at how that refinancing has played out so far this year, the unsecured market, the unsecured fraction, the blue bit, has been minuscule. It's almost all been secured on collateral, a good chunk of it, of course, through the ECB's LTRO operations. The unsecured market has found itself squeezed as investors have sought, through this arms race, security, have sought safety. This is a pattern from the right-hand side picture we've seen playing out not just this year, but for every one of the last 3 or 4 years. It too is an arms race. It too comes with a cost. It too results in banks' balance sheets being progressively more encumbered. They are signing away their assets to an increasing number of investors. Those assets cannot be signed away indefinitely. This is Barclays Capital's estimates of how much of banks' balance sheets in different countries are encumbered. Those numbers are almost certainly a significant understatement. This is a equilibrium that is self-fulfilling, because if I'm an unsecured creditor, why would I refinance on unsecured terms right now? Why should I let everyone else be ahead of me in the pecking order? And what we're seeing in a way is everyone converging on this high security, high safety, but ultimately self-defeating equilibrium. Last slide. What to do about it? Well, the first thing to say is if you buy the story, if you buy these arms races, which proliferate, I think, across finance, that there is a clear case for public intervention, both to protect the system and indeed to protect individuals within it. Here's a rare case where both the regulator and the regulated's incentives are in the same place. Point one. Point two, for that intervention to be effective, it needs not to focus on any one firm or individual business, but rather to look and to act, to coordinate across the system as a whole. It needs to be explicitly, overtly macroprudential rather than microprudential. Otherwise, you merely intensify the competitive scramble. And thirdly and finally, what would be the set of interventions that would make a difference to these 3 arms races I've mentioned? Well, on the return race, the answer is simple, relatively simple. With hindsight, we'd have capped leverage and forestalled this return on equity race. We might even have capped bonuses, which have been discussed, as you know, in Europe right now. We'd have sought certainly to seek for performance measures that made this race in returns less likely. On the speed front, we might stop at source, as some US regulators are now doing, this act of quote stuffing by placing restrictions on order cancellation. We might require traders in financial markets to commit to provide liquidity, trade continuity, price continuity. We might require circuit breakers that sit across the system as a whole. And finally, on the last race I mentioned, the safety race, this is the one where I would say regulators might have most to do. Right now, there are no restrictions on how much of a balance sheet, their balance sheets, banks are allowed to encumber. In future, we might need that if we're not to fall foul of these deeply socially suboptimal equilibria that I've been discussing. Let me stop there. Thank you.